The 5th generation console race forced Nintendo to rethink their entire strategy. This is because even if their Nintendo 64 console was great, it was a far cry from what the PlayStation achieved during its life cycle. With powerful hardware that was difficult to develop for, an awkward controller, and the use of cartridges when the industry was favoring CDs, Nintendo was plagued with decisions that played a role in Nintendo's lackluster sales. But in 1998, the Sega Dreamcast was released, and it had a hefty head start into the 6th generation of gaming, this time an entire year and a half ahead of Sony when they released the PlayStation 2 in the year 2000. Even Microsoft became a powerful contender with the release of the original Xbox in November of 2001. But finally, 3 days after that, the Nintendo GameCube entered the scene. As dearly beloved as this system is, there are so many reasons why this console still failed. The GameCube was a massive departure from what the Nintendo 64 was, and so much of it becomes obvious through its hardware. This console is shaped very differently than any other, and it is actually surprisingly small, resembling a lunchbox even. It becomes more apparent when you see the handle on the back, but there is so much to dissect about the GameCube, so let's go over everything in detail. Beginning with the biggest change. On the top there is a power button, a reset button, and a disc open tray, which is top loading. This is because Nintendo is now using discs for their systems. However, this is just a compromise as Nintendo is using proprietary mini discs. These discs hold up to 1.46 gigabytes, which is a massive improvement from their 64 megabyte cartridges from the previous generation. It was a compromise because Nintendo did fear that their games would be easy to make copies of if they stuck to normal CDs, as even if you somehow could copy these games onto another disc, then you can't play it on the GameCube. So they compromised on the size of disc, but this had another unintended result moving forward. These discs are more fragile as well, but it did help to prevent the sale of fake CDs since no other disc format would physically fit inside of the tray. So this did help with preventing piracy, at least until emulation eventually caught up. On the front, you will find 4 controller ports and now 2 memory card slots. So while Nintendo decided to continue supporting 4-way multiplayer, we now have the addition of memory cards to support our game saves. This is a very welcome addition, as now we don't have to depend on save batteries that will inevitably die one day when these should last much longer, and we have 2 of them as well, just as we did on the PlayStation 1, 2, and Dreamcast. So technically speaking, they were making many moves to show that their hardware was just as modern as the rest of the competition. On the back of the original GameCube, we get an analog AV out port as expected, but we even get a digital AV out port and a power connector. The analog AV connection was meant for your typical composite connection that could only support a resolution of up to 480i, while the digital AV out port supports 480p through a component connection through a seldom purchased first-party cable, which allowed for a genuinely nice improvement to your image quality if you had a TV that supported a component connection. But on the bottom, we have the high-speed port, the serial port 1 and serial port 2 ports. These all hide behind these covers that can be removed easily. For the first one, you were intended to connect the GameCube to the internet back in 2001 through a special adapter that you would need to purchase additionally, but there were very few games at all, less than a handful, that actually supported online play on the GameCube specifically, at least in the United States. The serial port 2 was intended only for developers to access, as there were never any accessories designed to be used with this port. Then finally, we have the high-speed port, which was designed to be used with the Game Boy player, which I do own. I even own the disc. This is an awesome accessory where you have the base, which connects to that high-speed port at the bottom and then screws onto your GameCube to secure it. And then you pop in the Game Boy player boot disc to finally insert any Game Boy Color, or Game Boy Advance game to play it to its entirety on your TV, and these games look very good when upscaled through the GameCube. Ironically, this is one of the best ways of playing Game Boy Advance on first-party hardware. So needless to say, Nintendo applied many of the things that they felt needed to change, as their Nintendo 64 was not considered a success. The GameCube so far embodies some of the features that in the early 2000s were becoming more and more important, and as such, we got a new controller. This controller was a massive improvement from the Nintendo 64's controller, as now this one has a much more traditional layout, and this one was received very well. The GameCube controller is genuinely comfortable in ways that no other controller really matches, even if I do think that there are more comfortable controllers out there, but none feel like the GameCube's controller. We get an ABXY layout with a bigger emphasis on the A button, smaller emphasis on the B button, and the X and Y buttons are not used as frequently as these were, so they were made smaller. The analog stick is now vastly improved as it feels more smooth when controlling, and the C buttons were converted into its own analog stick. It is smaller than the left stick, but it's still fairly easy to use, which is what we all wanted. But the D-pad is actually quite disappointing as it was made much smaller to now become about the size as a Game Boy Advance's D-pad. Thankfully, this wasn't a huge issue because not many games ended up using it, but for those that did, they were not pleasant to control with the D-pad. Then finally, you have your shoulder buttons and the Z button placed here too. Frankly, I don't think that you will ever find triggers with this aggressive of a spring, as you will feel everything when you press these triggers, but they also offer the most feedback from any other triggers that I've used before. Some people really like this, and I personally never hated them. The GameCube had many positives in terms of design from the console down to the controller, and this did become more attractive to third-party developers. However, it is hard to argue that there is a more iconic console design in existence, and it launched at $199. So as expected from Nintendo, people were waiting to see what Nintendo had in store even after the PlayStation 2 released, and as such, the GameCube released with a few notable titles, but it's actually the titles that came later on that make the GameCube such a well-remembered console. This is the GameCube's legacy. In theory, the GameCube should have been much more attractive to third-party developers for two major reasons. As Nintendo is now using discs, developers do have a lot more storage to work with than they did even with the highest storage N64 cartridge, but it was still about a fourth of the size that a normal disc could hold on other systems. So I imagine that this on its own probably didn't do enough to sway too many developers to work with Nintendo. But it is not a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. The other reason is that the GameCube was a lot easier to develop for, as it uses a less complex architecture for the CPU. Both of these aspects were what made the Nintendo 64 difficult to work with previously, and that's exactly what Nintendo addressed with this console. However, there was one major trend that Nintendo did not capitalize on very much, and that was online play. As mentioned earlier, the GameCube did have online functionality, but very few games were released on the GameCube that actually played online. And the reason why is because Nintendo did not have any servers of their own, and instead left developers in charge of sustaining servers for their games. As a result, hardly any developers put their online-only titles on the GameCube. So while the GameCube did still have pretty great third-party titles, they mostly had to depend on their first-party titles once more to sell their system. The GameCube launched with 12 titles, with the most notable ones being Super Monkey Ball, Luigi's Mansion, and Crazy Taxi. While there was disappointment in the air as a Mario-related launch title is all that we got, Luigi's Mansion is a very beloved game as it introduced us to Luigi in such a way that we simply haven't seen him before, with some very charming cartoon horror. Crazy Taxi, on the other hand, was a driving simulator that was heavily stylized, and even though it was introduced to just about every other platform at this time, Crazy Taxi just seems to fit so well on the GameCube. This generation was incredibly experimental for Nintendo, as they took games like Metroid and gave us Metroid Prime 1 and 2, which were first-person shooters, and nobody expected to see this series being played like this, but it became a must-have on this console. And of course, Super Mario Sunshine entered the ring, and while it was definitely not what people were expecting, it still sold quite well for a GameCube game, and it did play differently, which some enjoyed and others did not. But there were lots of Mario games on the GameCube to enjoy, such as Paper Mario, The Thousand Year Door, Mario Kart Double Dash, the Mario Party games, which looked really good on the system, Mario Golf, among other sports titles for Mario specifically, and even a dancing game, Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix. There was no shortage of Mario for this generation. And of course, a massively popular game even to this day is Super Smash Bros. Melee. As a sequel to the original on the N64, this game shows the GameCube's graphical prowess, and of course, as many people will tell you, has a much more complex combat system than you would think from just grabbing the game and playing it. This one is a dearly beloved game. On the Zelda side of things, we got Wind Waker, which, while a lot of people were not happy about the shift in art style, still ended up being one of the best games on the GameCube. Personally, I was always a lot more interested in one that was released a little bit later, Twilight Princess. This game features my favorite Zelda art style, as it feels much more serious. I understand what hasn't aged too well, but I sometimes really wish that Nintendo brought this back for at least one more game. Additionally, there were many, and I mean many, first-party games that were only on the GameCube that are dearly beloved, such as Pokemon Colosseum, Pokemon DX Scale of Darkness, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, Animal Crossing, Beautiful Joe, Pikmin, with some exclusives such as Metal Gear Solid, Twin Snakes, Beyond Good and Evil, which did release on other platforms, Shadow the Hedgehog, which most people did not like, but I do, among others, and even some of the best third-party games that still made it onto the GameCube, such as Resident Evil 2, Skies of Arcadia, Killer 7, Soul Calibur 2, and yes, the Naruto Clash of Ninja series was a lot of fun, just not as fun as the Ultimate Ninja series. In other words, there are lots of fun games to be played on the GameCube. That's exactly why collectors also target GameCube games, because there are a lot of gems on that system that unfortunately didn't make it extremely appealing back in the early 2000s, but now people are recalling the uniqueness of this platform. Even if the GameCube did have a lot of great games on its system, these were largely games that could only be shared with others who were in your immediate vicinity. On top of that, the competition was releasing a lot of incredible games that met the needs of many people. As such, this becomes a big reason why the GameCube could not soar. PlayStation 2 and Xbox just had most of what the majority of people wanted. This is what they had. The idea behind online gaming was a pretty big deal back in the early 2000s, and the consoles that tried to capitalize on this the most, as they recognized the importance of it, were the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and the Xbox. This definitely hurt Nintendo a lot more than I initially thought, as someone who mostly plays single-player games anyway. The PlayStation 2 had a lot of really good games that had online functionality, such as Mortal Kombat Armageddon, Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal, SOCOM 2, Twisted Metal Black Online, Monster Hunter, among others, but it had online-only games that were absolutely massive. And for this category, Final Fantasy XI comes to mind, which is a game that still has a very dedicated following today. But we also had EverQuest Online, Phantasy Star Online, among others. Another important factor is that the PlayStation 2 can actually play DVDs, so it already covers two major sectors that were important in the early 2000s. But the PlayStation 2 had Kingdom Hearts, Chain of Memories, and Kingdom Hearts 2, which were massive and insanely popular. Of course, Final Fantasy X is still one of the best Final Fantasy games ever made. X-2 was still a lot of fun, and Final Fantasy XII brought a lot of fun to many homes. Shadow of the Colossus deserves a mention, same as the God of War games, but also we can't ignore games like Naruto Ultimate Ninja 1 through 5, the Budokai and Tenkaichi games, specifically 3 for both and such. These games were only on the PlayStation 2, and the library of amazing games does not end there, not by any means. Then the Xbox had Forza Motorsport, which was a very important racing game at this time, and it also featured online play. Not to mention that the Elder Scrolls Morrowind made its way onto the Xbox, which is a huge RPG with tons of depth, and became a strong competitor to Sony's offerings. Then there is Halo, which was the system seller for the Xbox. Other notable mentions were Knights of the Old Republic, Fable, The Lost Chapters, and many more. There was no shortage of games of many varieties that were available between the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, even if they both had amazing exclusives. But games that made it onto both were games like Silent Hill 2, Grand Theft Auto games like GTA San Andreas, GTA 3, Resident Evil, Thief, and many more. Even if the Dreamcast was nowhere near as powerful as those other systems, they still had offerings that Nintendo didn't bother too much to address. Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 did release on the Dreamcast first, but they eventually were brought over to the GameCube. But games like Jet Set Radio, Power Stone 2, among others, definitely helped this console. But they did have third-party support worth mentioning, which did offer online play such as Phantasy Star Online, but none of it was enough to keep the Dreamcast alive for long. Once more, because of Nintendo's reluctance to fully embrace trends, Nintendo had a difficult time competing for the second generation in a row. As great as GameCube games were, they did not embrace the most important trend of this generation, and even when it came to their third-party support, they didn't have anything close to what the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox had. The Dreamcast died soon after, but Nintendo kept pushing onward. However, it does seem like Nintendo was forced to recognize that it was time to try something new, and to abandon ship for the GameCube. Nintendo simply could not compete in the same way that the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox competed, and it definitely shows as these sales numbers do not lie. The Dreamcast sold 9 million units. The GameCube only sold 21 million units, and in terms of raw sales, they competed handily with the Xbox, which sold 24 million units, but the PlayStation 2 sold 160 million units, shattering all kinds of gaming expectations. When Nintendo just wasn't at the top anymore, it was a very upsetting realization, seeing that they were now at the bottom with Sega. Just 5 years later, Nintendo simply didn't see a future for the GameCube any longer, as they had been working on a different concept for some time, one that they actually intended to have with the GameCube, but it never happened. Even if the GameCube was a failure by sales metrics, this is a console that is very well remembered to this day. So it was a failure in our minds, but never in our hearts. So Nintendo made another push into the upcoming generation. This was an absolute juggernaut, and essentially marked a change within Nintendo that persisted for a very long time, and that is still present today. We will talk about this system in the future, so stay tuned. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.